Welcome to the Caught in the Wild Real-World Threat Find Seminar. This is a series, an installment of the series, which we do regularly, where we talk about real-world threat finds we discovered in anonymized customer environments, and we try to highlight the most interesting aspects and the most important aspects to show what it means for the bigger threat landscape. I'm joined by Andrew today, Andrew Tsonchev, our Director of Technology. I'm Max Heinemeyer, the Director of Threat Hunting. We're both technical directors, quite hands-on, quite technical, as the title says. So we're not afraid of going into the weeds and the deep dive details. As for housekeeping, for the next 30 minutes, we're going to run the seminar. We spend roughly 20 minutes on the content, and the last 10 minutes we reserve for discussion between Andrew and myself. I'm going to have some questions that I'm going to pose to Andrew, who's going to kindly present the content. So without any further ado, Andrew, can you get us started with the agenda? We don't have many points today, right? We're just together for 30 minutes. So I would take just 1 to 3 minutes to talk a bit about Darktrace. I assume not everybody here of the audience knows everything about us, so I keep that short. It's not a Darktrace focused seminar, it's about the threats we found. Then we're gonna jump over to Andrew, who will gladly talk about a threat find in Microsoft 365 and an account hijack. And then, like I said, for the last 10 minutes, we talk in the discussion and the Q&A session about anything coming up. So who are we? Well, our company is called Darktrace, obviously, and we combine cybersecurity with artificial intelligence, mainly unsupervised machine learning. We've been around since 2013, so quite a while, and it's been a stellar growth journey, right? We've got roughly, this slide is out of date already, I think it's roughly 1,400 employees now. We kept hiring during COVID because we've got such an appetite, and we are one of the UK's unicorns with over a $2 billion valuation, almost 4,000 customers by now. And what we do at the core is we are a security software provider, and we take data sets, maybe network data, maybe email data, maybe software as a service data, SaaS, and we apply unsupervised machine learning to detect anomalies. And we do this because we don't want to predefine evil. We don't want to say more than 50 megabytes in 10 minutes to a blacklisted range of IP addresses or geolocations. If you do this, I used to be a penetration tester for 10 years, then you never catch the bad guys that know their crafts, because you're always going to maybe see a bad guy use 45 megabytes in 11 minutes to an IP address that you don't have in your threat intelligence list. So instead of that, we say an unusual amount of traffic based on the machine learning, auto-detected, what means normal for a device, for a P group, and for the overall network, in a weird amount of time to an unusual destination on the internet. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Andrew, we can take a tiny peek under the hood and look at how this actually works from a tech perspective. So here you see kind of the architecture, the last slide I want to talk about before we dive straight into the threat find and how Darktrace works. We have the Enterprise Immune System, our flagship product on the left-hand side, which is about detection. That uses the unsupervised machine learning, like the human immune system, learning every time we deploy in every new organization from scratch to understand normal. So when Darktrace comes in and does the free proof of value with you, a free trial, maybe in your network environment, we deploy with physical sensors or virtual sensors at core switches, and we passively span the network traffic or tap it, and we learn from scratch every time we deploy locally with the customer what means normal. We don't take learning data like supervised machine learning from other customers and try to apply it to you. That doesn't work, that doesn't scale, and every network is unique. So we don't do this. We learn from scratch every time we deploy, and we don't send all your data off to some third-party Darktrace cloud to do some black box machine learning. All the machine learning stays local in your environment. Darktrace can be run completely offline, doesn't need daily updates for signatures or anything like that. That's what we don't believe in, right? We don't want to push daily signature updates. We want to look for weird behavior, the higher levels of the pyramid of pain, and detect these unusual behaviors. And that's just detection. We can also respond to things by enforcing normal behavior. So not like a traditional IPS system or some email gateway where we just enforce binary rules, if, else, then. But we say, look, the Citrix server has started crypto mining. It never does that. And it started beaconing, so repeated command control connections to Russia, China, and Iran. It's never done that before. And it started downloading unusual executables from rare destinations, which it never does because it's a Citrix server. So what we could do is we could stop the weird behavior, crypto mining, the beaconing command control traffic, the download of further payloads without interrupting the normal core business behavior, because we know what normal means compared to unusual. And we do this across a range of data points. You see it at the bottom of the slide. Could be cloud data, PaaS, IaaS, SaaS, email environments, ICS, industrial control systems, or normal networks. So that's really what we do here at Darktrace at the core. And like I promised, I don't want to take too much time on this. Some of you will know about this already, but what we really want to focus on in the next 15, 20 minutes is one of the interesting threats we found. So Andrew, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much, Max, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk through one particular recent example from a customer. This was a technology company in APAC, in the Asia Pacific region. And we see a lot of SaaS compromises, more so than ever currently, as you might expect, with the shift to remote working and the increased digitization that most of our customers have had to accelerate and go through over the last few months. And so in a few of these sessions, we've talked about various kinds. We've talked about a box compromise. We've talked about another O365 business email compromise attack before. And in general, what we've talked about in these sessions before is the sense that these attacks are quite hard to detect because they have a reduced attack footprint. And what usually happens is that the attacks begin with credential stuffing. So at the moment that the attack starts, you get an authenticated login to the environment. The attacker's already got the password. They've got it somewhere else, maybe from a data dump from a previous attack or from a phishing email. And so if you take just a slice of how did this person get compromised and this account become hijacked, and then what happened, there's no initial indicators of compromise for that. It's just a login and it's authenticated. And you have to try and figure out whether it's the real user or it's someone impersonating them based on what they do inside the third-party application, what files they access, changes happen inside that environment. And so that can be quite tricky. But what I want to talk about today is this example, which really draws attention, and this is something that isn't talked about that much, to the way that these individual compromises don't happen in isolation. There's a possible chaining effect. And that's really powerful, and it's really important to be aware of this. What I mean by that is that when you compromise one SaaS account, that can be the infection vector or the method that's used to compromise another SaaS account. So when you look at one on its own, you go, oh, how did this start? The answer to how it started might be an entirely separate previous compromise of a SaaS environment. And this means that not only is there the damage that can be done inside one account if it's taken over, and the potential damage that can happen to the company reputation if that account is used to launch, say, phishing attacks externally to the business. But if you don't detect it and you don't stop it, that foothold can move laterally, if you like, to compromise other SaaS accounts. And we're very familiar with thinking about lateral movement in a network context. We know that maybe a particular employee's laptop, if it gets compromised, doesn't have particularly sensitive data on it. So that in itself may not be a big problem, but the bigger problem is that from that foothold, that implant, the attacker can then pivot and move and compromise more important systems. The same sort of principle applies in the SaaS world. So this example started with credential stuffing. So again, the first account comes out of the blue, the attacker just logs in, and they get inside the environment. But this time, once they hijack that account, we saw a number of behaviors. So one is we saw what you typically see in this sort of attack, which is the attacker doing things like changing rules, accessing files, moving around inside the account and covering up their footsteps. But then we saw them launch a bunch of phishing emails. And phishing is quite often the sort of next logical step when you take over an account and you use it to send out spam. We see that quite a lot with customers. But in this case, the phishing targets were both external and internal to the company. And that's the most important part of this, because internal phishing is incredibly effective. We think about what we do to protect ourselves from phishing, all the SKIM, DMARC, DKIM, SPF stuff that's out there. That's somewhat effective at the best of times, but obviously you completely sidestep around all of that stuff if you are launching your phishing attack from a compromised internal user. You don't have to spoof the user, you are the user. And detecting that email is potentially malicious is very difficult to do for most security solutions, because it's an email from a colleague to a colleague. And in this case, I'll talk you through it in a second, that the contents of the email were very believable and highly targeted. So we know this is a targeted attack. So very tricky to detect. And in this case, it worked. So in this case, that compromise attack was used to pivot and move laterally and compromise another account inside the business. So let's understand how that happens, because this is a pretty critical path of potential escalation in the environment. So initially, we saw the login. At that point, what do you have to tell you that this is something potentially bad? Well, the only thing you really have to go on is where the attack comes from. And so if you track where users are in the world and you understand geographically how teams are distributed, what potential offices or locations and homes a particular user lives in and works from, then you get the first good chance of catching something bad happening by saying that the location of this login is not the user's usual location. On its own, that's typically not enough necessarily to say with good confidence that you've got an attack, but that's the lead. That's the first sign that maybe something strange is happening. And then once you analyze what goes on inside that session when they're logged in, then you can start to reassemble the breadcrumbs and see that this is actually a hijack of an account. So you have that, and then you get some reconnaissance. You know, attackers typically go and they look at some resources. This is how you can tell this is hands on keyboard and not automated, because they poke around a bit and they set up inbox rules. And the inbox rules do a couple of things. One, before they set up the rules, they tend to go in and delete any initial emails that were the source of the initial compromise. So they cover up their tracks. And the second thing they do is they put new rules in place to cover up subsequent phishing behavior. So they put rules in place that say that any outbound emails from this account should be immediately moved from sent into deleted and hard deleted from there removed, so that they clear up the evidential trail that this account is sending out spam from the environment and targeting third parties. So this attack then began sending phishing emails, both internally and externally. So the external is the spread. So this customer, technology customer in APAC, they were probably compromised from another company. So it daisy chains from company to company like this, but they also move laterally inside the company. So the phishing emails that were sent, they contained a real OneDrive link. And so they were sent to internal employees, and they had a sort of a OneDrive page with a document that was titled "Click and Review the Document." It said "Contract and Proposal" with the customer's name, so very crafted specifically to this customer, very believable. People click on it, and then inside the OneDrive link, you had a second hidden link. It said "Click in to here to reveal and view the document," and that took you to the malicious website that was hosting the fake login page to grab the credentials and then repeat. And so we saw these sent at 1:30, and then we saw login from the same rare location to a second user identity, which is pretty good indication that this is the attack spreading to another account. It was about 4 hours from the first compromise to the compromise of the second. Idea of the time scale we're dealing with here and how sort of a medium pace attack. It's not instantaneous, it doesn't take days, but within a few hours, the attacker had escalated to a second account. And if we weren't detecting this and we weren't going in and deactivating those accounts and locking out the users, then you would get third, fourth, fifth accounts, and at some point the attacker will hit something very, very valuable inside the SaaS environment. So let's take a look at what this looked like inside Darktrace. So this kind of illustrates some of the things that Max was talking about. We're looking here at sort of the early indicator, that anomalous behavior, and this is what I said is a sort of lead, right? You go, here's an unusual use of credentials. So this is an APAC customer, and you can see if you look here, there's a login from the Netherlands, from this ASN, and Darktrace profiled that location as 90% unexpected or unusual for this user, for the business, understanding where the users are distributed. That gets a very high 95% anomaly score, but on its own, it's not a security incident, it's just an early indicator. If we look into the more detailed series of events that this pane is showing us on the right here, first thing to look at is this timeline. This is, you know, hour after hour, day after day, what this uses.
Sorry to interrupt you, Andrew. One of our audience members said they can't see your screen. I can see the screen. Maybe you can stop sharing and just reshare.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out.
Okay. Hopefully it's now back.
I can see your screen again.
Okay.
So if there's still issues, please let us know in the chat, but it might be on your side, on the client side, because I can at least see it.
All right. Thanks for that, Max. Yeah, so if we look at this timeline, what we're seeing here is sort of day after day, this is what the user does, and Darktrace is breaking down and tracking the types of behavior on the right here. So you can see the sorts of activities that this user has been doing in the environment, mostly sort of logging in and viewing pages and viewing files. And then suddenly here we have this cluster of behavior, and this follows that initial weird login. So you get the login, and then you can see in this sort of log here what happens. You get them moving items to deleted items, that's covering tracks. You get the creation and setting of inbox rules, and all of these get scored by Darktrace as highly significant anomalies. So at this point, we know that something very strange is going on inside this environment. But that's kind of not the end of it, because you need to investigate what's happened. So we've got the early indicators and we know something strange is going on, but you want to put this all together. So, you know, in this sort of model of how this works with detect, respond, and investigate, this triggers an investigation. And so this is quite sort of informative to look at. This is the finalized incident report that Darktrace produces in this case. So this is what was provided automatically by the software to that customer. They get sent this and they can look at it. And this summarizes why we think that there's been a possible hijack of their account. So you can see here, we get a human written summary, number of suspicious requests for this OT65 service from this IP, based on the behavior, the rule created. This looked very strange, and you can see here, we provide details about what happened, where it came from, the agent carrying out the activity, the summary of it. Here it's the timing and the configuration changes, and there were 2 updates made to this resource path, and we get a timeline up here showing when this happened. So Darktrace will automatically investigate this, and if it can figure out, and it says, we believe based on analysis of the evidence and a mixture of supervised and unsupervised machine learning that this is a compromised account, and we'll tell you about it immediately. And it's only by detecting this that you can then go in and you can respond and remediate to this and stop it spreading. So I thought that was an interesting attack to share with you, because everyone's aware that there's data that sits in O365, and everyone's aware that phishing emails happen. But it's worth talking about the way these separate threats come together, how phishing works hand in hand with an account compromise, works hand in hand with a second wave of phishing internally and externally, which then leads to another account compromise. And you need to think about these as chained behaviors if you want to protect the overall integrity of the business, because these isolated user accounts that get compromised can be footholds to both achieving the goal, but also stepping stones to lateral movement across the environment. So I'm going to stop there and hand you back to Max, and Max can see if we want to do any Q&A discussion now of that.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I at least found that super interesting, Andrew. So if there's any questions from the audience, in addition to the ones sent through already, please post them now. I've got a few which I want to point to you, Andrew, but I want to highlight something, you know, in how we detected this that really stands out, which is completely understandable, normal for you and me, because we see this every day, but maybe not so much for the audience. You pointed out various subtle anomalies like logins from weird locations, inbox rule changes, which normally don't happen, more logins from other locations, inbox rules that redirect emails, hard deletes, which normally don't happen. And this is what we detect in the first stage at Darktrace, all these subtle anomalies. That's what our machine learning does, right? And that's impressive in itself. But we don't show, we can see that if we dig underneath the hood, but we don't alert on every single anomaly, because that would just flood SOC teams and security people with too many alerts, right? So it's quite important to understand that while we can see these subtle anomalies, what we highlight is, and alert to, is the chain of anomalies. And if some come together and understand the behavior as bigger picture. So that's a fallacy that many anomaly detection systems in the past did. They alert to every single anomaly, and that's just flooding people, not giving context and having too many alerts. So instead of that, we put them together to higher level, higher ordinate behavior, especially with the last thing you've shown, the AI analyst, which uses some supervised learning on top based on human workflows and highlights only the most interesting things. So it's actually quite easy to understand, but I thought I'd make this distinction again, because for you and me, that's very obvious, right? Because we use it every day, but maybe not so much for our audience.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the reason signature-based tools look for known things, and because they look for known things, when they detect something, they label it and they say what it is. So they do detection of a potential incident and confirmation and categorization of that all as one thing. They don't have the idea of maybe this is an incident. They just go, it's an incident or it's not an incident. because that's how the signature works. And so if you naively build an anomaly detection tool on the same methodology, you're not taking advantage of what's really unique about anomalies. What's unique about anomalies is that they are open-ended. They could be lots of things. And so that's why it's really important in the technology that you have this distinction between anomalies are not the final product. They are early indicators. And then you correlate them together, you analyze them, and you figure out what you found afterwards. And people aren't used to thinking about this investigation as separate from detection, because that's a more sophisticated way of doing it. That's how humans do investigation. And that's not traditionally how IDS and AV and endpoint tools have worked. But that is how it should work with machine learning. You should find anomalies, and anomalies aren't the end of it. They're the early indicator. And then you should analyze them to try and reach conclusions about patterns, about what's behind them. And it's the result of that that should be consumed by the humans, not the raw anomalies themselves, usually.
And I don't want to branch out into a discussion around SOAR, security orchestration automation, but I think we're unique here because most automation solutions that try to automate the investigation, they focus on the non-interesting stuff, right? If you use a SOAR, you want to automate those workflows that are boring, check and virus total, check the age of a domain, stuff like that. We take the opposite approach. We take every bit of data and have supervised algorithms go through workflows that actual analysts do to analyze interesting incidents, to understand, hey, what I'm looking at here, what is it? Try to make sense of it. So just thought I'd put this out. I've got a few questions coming in. Some of them actually duplicates to what I had in place here, so really good to see this. And I want to post one to you. The internal angle is very difficult to spot, but wouldn't two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication help reduce this attack surface? And have a think about it. I want to give my perspective because in prep for our discussion, I've thought about this quite a bit. And I think, yes, of course, 2FA will always help, but the attackers will find always this one account or the newly onboarded account or the one where the employee doesn't have a phone yet, or, you know, the account that's been orphaned or a temporary account or a guest account that doesn't have the 2FA or VIP that refuses to use multi-factor authentication for reasons. And it's not the 80% that use MFA, but it's the 20% which you don't see, which you forget about, the shadow IT, the newly provisioned accounts. Or we've seen accounts where 2FA has been circumvented with SIM swap attacks, for example, or sophisticated social engineering, phoning people up and trying to get the second factor. So I completely and wholeheartedly agree it helps reduce things. But Andrew, what I want to pose to you is, I feel like in the SaaS world, we almost comparatively, like we were in the network world 10 years ago, we mainly think about prevention, not so much about detection, and we mainly think about the perimeter, right? If we think about the interesting angle here, the interesting angle to my perspective is the internal angle, like they used the inbox to compromise more accounts internally. And no SaaS solution, no CASB, no Office 365, no email gateway looks for that. So again, in email and SaaS, we have this approach of a border, the fence, an inside and an outside. We don't have a really zero trust perspective. Whereas on the network, we're quite used to think compromised. We assume compromised. Every device makes weird things. Every device is behaving weirdly. So now I'm branching out this, question around 2FA, MFA, but what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, it's super interesting stuff. I agree with everything you said, obviously, Max. Undoubtedly, 2FA and MFA really locks things down. It's way better. I think we're only beginning to see attackers having to actually take technical steps to circumvent it. That's why there's been this massive surge in SIM swap attacks recently. It's been all over the news because, for the longest time, attackers just didn't need to. They'd go after the accounts that didn't have 2FA on them. And once they need to, actually, then you start looking at other things. You look at people compromising and attacking the actual 2FA platforms. You look at sort of complex replay attacks with sort of single sign identities being stolen. You look at people compromising devices on the network and then using those with cached sessions and trusted devices to get onto. So there's a whole web of ways in which you can get around 2FA and MFA if you need to, which is something that attackers will start doing as this becomes more prevalent. But it's a bit like SPF and DKIM stuff. It's like everyone should have that turned on, but they don't. And almost every customer we deal with, you'll get phishing emails that have SPF passed and DKIM passed and they're malicious. And there's lots of reasons for this. It can be things like outsourcing to a third-party company that does your HR, and you need to delegate them access so they get on an allowed list. You can have all sorts of stuff like this that mean that what seems like a very simple solution on paper just doesn't work in the real world. And so that means exactly as you said, that it's not enough to assume that you can design these environments so that you'll keep the bad guys out of them. And it is very much like we saw a few years ago in the network space. You're right, CASBs are essentially firewalls for the cloud. That's a little bit uncharitable, but essentially they are. They're focusing very much on policy enforcement and controlling what people can do in what applications. That's still the mindset that thinks that we will eliminate our threat by defining correct operating models. And it's always sidestepped by the creativity and ingenuity of attackers. And they will find a way in, and they are finding a way in. And so whatever your model is, you've got to have something in place that analyzes what goes on inside the applications and doesn't treat them as a trusted zone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I've got nothing to add. I'm just looking at loads of questions coming in, which is great, and only 2 minutes left. So let me go through some of them really quickly. One question is, how do we implement Darktrace? How can we, how's this happening? So if we look at the SaaS environment for Darktrace, we normally use either a Darktrace cloud instance, which you can log into, or your Darktrace on-premise. And then we use your SaaS accounts, your corporate SaaS accounts, to get the SaaS security logs and do anomaly detection on top of that. So it's all based on, anything that's in the SaaS environment, and it's all in your one pane of glass combined with Darktrace email, combined with Darktrace network, so we can get the synergies going. But if we think only about SaaS, it's super simple to deploy. It takes minutes mostly. We run, as you can see on the slide, 3 proof of values to, deploy this. Very little pain, no pain at all. Just deploy it, takes an hour or so to deploy, and you start seeing results. The learning doesn't take long, 5 to 7 business days, and you see the first results. I'm happy to talk through in detail in a one-on-one conversation. Just looking at more things. A question about COVID-19 and how the normal is being changed. That's too big a topic to fully go into details now. It changed a lot of threats we're seeing on the threat landscape. For Darktrace, the beauty is, like we explained, Darktrace continues to learn. So in the first week of COVID, everybody goes remote. Darktrace says, hang on, things are changing. People remote in and, the offices are empty. But then after a few days, it learned this new normal and it can show new threats. So we didn't have to change any signatures, any rules, any detection engineering, which was beautiful. It adapts to the environment. It adapts to change, which is so powerful. We have various blogs on our website that talk about the changes we see in phishing due to COVID and attacks due to COVID. So maybe have a look there, or reach out over info@Darktrace or at Shell Demon to me, over LinkedIn to Andrew, over LinkedIn to me, and we can have a longer discussion around the COVID changes. A bit too much now because we only have like a minute left. I don't want to overrun too much here. And just the last bit here, and sorry, Andrew, for cutting you short. I know I'm sure you've got many thoughts on this, but one question was about a specific Oracle software service solution, if it's good, if it's bad. I personally haven't looked at it. We try to steer away from looking at, specific super individual SaaS solutions. We take the data in these SaaS solutions and generalize them to a certain level. We say it's weird login events, it's weird authentication, it's weird administrative events, it's resources that are being accessed in an unusual fashion. I think the important step is to think about every vendor like Oracle does the best they can do to prevent attacks and to secure their cloud, but not so much for the detection purposes and not so much in the context of your organization. And that's the beauty of Darktrace, right? If we take the SaaS logs from your Oracle, we also see your Oracle databases in the network. We see your email traffic relating to Oracle, and we can stitch it together to an overarching story giving you the context. So I don't know too much about Oracle SaaS, if it's secure or not, can't comment on that, but providers doing their best to do this. And I think it's important to have an overarching layer that can look at the meta level, so to speak. So sorry if we couldn't answer all the questions, and sorry for cutting you short as well, Andrew, but I think we're going to close here because we're running over time already. I don't want to steal people's day away. If you got any further questions, any feedback, we love feedback. Was this interesting? Was this not interesting? Could we improve this? More Darktrace, less Darktrace, more threats, less threats, more technical, less technical. Let us know. Just drop a line at info@Darktrace. Stay safe, take care, bye.